a dimly lit room with 10 souls gathered. Shallow breaths stirred colorless candle flames, their weak, flickering light unable to pierce the suffocating shadows surrounding them. The air nearly suffocated the burning life, heavy and oppressive. The only exits were securely locked. The old oak door with no brass key in sight loomed in the darkness. The aged shutter securely fastened to fogged window glass, a barrier against the shimmering moonlight outside. Restless eyes betrayed their owners, the gleam from the flames revealing their anxiety and immense hesitation. They would uncomfortably shift, peering into the half-darkened orbs of their peers, who mirrored their similar dread. Clammy hands braced their neighbors, clenched together as their iced blood drifted through their blue veins, contrasting with ashen knuckles. The doddering floorboards groaned a mournful protest as trembling feet adjusted uncontrollably. This was not their first night they had gathered in this room for this purpose, nor, they feared, it would be their last. It was another midnight beckoning, a desperate attempt to summon. Would it answer their call tonight, like it had so many times before? Or would it finally grow wearisome of their constant pestering? Might it finally reveal itself, offering them the chance at last to realize its true identity? Their luck, thus far, had been so cruelly denied. It was hollow yet solid, fragile yet stern. Clamping throats captured unknown words as the group intently watched the encircling fire wildly dance in response to something unseen now circling them. The air grew stagnant, frozen, its chilled fangs painfully biting on their exposed skin. No one dared rise from their seats, nor dared speak without permission. It was pressing closer with each passing moment. Invisible yet undeniable, a presence older than madness itself. Then, it spoke to them. A disembodied but haunting whisper drifting just behind their open ears, confirming their most dreaded nightmare. He had finally arrived. Another midnight gathering to host him. Another midnight gathering for their undead guest to oblige them. Welcome back to the Moonlight Lore podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and you're listening to the Philip Experiment. It may be a vain attempt, but the pursuit of knowledge has been known to lead humanity to unbelievable destinations. The idea that life could somehow continue after we cast off these fragile mortal bodies is a maddening thought, its answer forever elusive and taunting. It has plagued our species for eons, and yet we have never once come close to a definitive answer. Some may cling to the comforting belief that paradise awaits us, a kingdom of eternal peace and joy. Others resign themselves to the bleak notion that death in this world marks the final ending, an eternal descent into the void of oblivion. And then there are those who conceive of a concept so ludicrous, it's almost difficult for some to imagine. That our souls, or spirits, are forever tethered by invisible strings to specific locations we may have once held dear. The truth is, it is impossible to know. It's a veil no living soul has ever been able to fully lift, yet the yearning to look beyond that thin barrier, to see where our answers may lie, incessantly drives us. Some more than others. Certain knowledge demands a steep and often unforgiving price. For most of us, that payment is simply the inevitable toll of mortality, a reality we all must face eventually. Yet for some, who simply cannot contain their burning curiosity, the idea of being forced to wait for the cold embrace of our graves is too unbearable to endure. Instead, they decide to pursue the unthinkable. They dare to surpass death itself and directly provoke those who are already dead. Such paths are by no means casual endeavors. It requires certain untold rituals, whispered incantations, or forbidden invocations. Ancient practices discreetly passed down from countless generations to the next. Although they have since faded to become rather rare in our modern age, seances were once regarded as the leading practice in order to summon the lost souls of those who have since passed on. And while such gatherings are typically invigorated by feelings of hope, fear, or despair, beneath the spectacle is often a layer of malicious deceit. False mediums appear to be a dime a dozen nowadays, always preying on the vulnerable and frequently arriving on vague conclusions that have the potential to be harmful to those they claim to lend aid to. It's an unfortunate reality, but there might yet be some lingering truth. Behind every fraudster exposed, there may yet be moments when the veil between life and death had truly thinned, when something otherworldly had indeed answered the beckoning call. Of course, such occasions are near impossible to authenticate. In many aspects regarding the realm of the paranormal, we unfortunately find this uncharted world to be haunted by an unyielding dilemma: the absence of definitive proof. How can these bizarre, almost unexplainable experiences be measured in any meaningful way that includes the scientific method, building upon tangible variables and repeatable results? If the possibility was present, might someone inadvertently discover the undeniable truth discreetly nestled behind the paranormal? That there is some form of existence beyond our approaching deaths? Or is it all just a hallucination, a way for us humans to come to terms with our inevitable destinies? Ghosts have an objective reality, but they are solely created out of the minds of those who believe to see them. A bold statement made by a rather curious man who found such daunting inquiries to have taken rapid hold of his mind back in the early 1970s. Dr. George Owen, an experienced parapsychologist and mathematician, was determined to find truth to his claim that hallucinations were created by those who believed in them. But in order to do so, he was required to conjure up a peculiar experiment, one that would ultimately go on to make history. He had christened it the Philip experiment, a bold and unsettling endeavor that would push a great many boundaries in order to summon one particular spirit sharing the experiment's name: Philip Aylesford. From the Toronto Society for Psychical Research, TSPR, Owen called upon 8 individuals, each plucked from various walks of life, and of whom were complete strangers to one another. The only shared connection being that of their intrigue regarding the paranormal. None had ever exhibited psychic anomalies, nor harbored any extrasensory perception abilities. They were simply normal folks who were brought in to become willing participants. Lorne, an industrial engineer, a creative and artistic individual who pursued his studies into Oriental philosophy and ancient history. Andy, Lorne's wife, shared her husband's interests but was also drawn to astronomy. A housewife known as Dorothy, sharp in mind, having trained in bookkeeping and accounting. Al, a self-employed heating engineer with a keen eye for photography. Bernice, an accountant whose restless mind perused a degree of various world philosophies. Sue, a former nurse and chairman of the Canadian chapter of Mensa, her intellect sculpted by years of experience. Sydney, the youngest member, a sociology student who had temporarily stepped away from academia to travel the world. And finally, Iris, the wife of Dr. George Owen himself, an accomplished figure in nursing and social work, director of the New Horizon Research Foundation, co-founder of TSPR, and later an author who would go on to write the 1976 book Conjuring Up Philip, regarding the experiment she was about to take part in. Accompanying the gathered subjects were Dr. George Owen and psychiatrist Dr. Joel Witten. While the pair would be present, they also remained distant, silent observers whose pen scratching would be the only sounds the two would permit themselves. They would not interfere. They would not speak. They would watch and take notes while the 8 fulfilled their duty in conjuring Philip. The goals Dr. Owen had lingered in his mind while conceiving his radical plan was to address an uncertainty he felt weighing on his shoulders regarding psychokinetic phenomena that often occurred during mediumship sittings or seances. Ceaseless rapping created by unseen hands, tables wobbling and lifting from the floor seemingly by their own accord. Did these events require the presence of at least one individual gifted with psychic powers to act as a conduit? Under plain view, would these so-called disturbances manifest under the cold scrutiny of others? And most importantly of all, were these forces truly the work of something summoned, or could they stem from the unconscious will of the participants themselves? It was during the group's very first meeting, long before resorting to mystifying practices, would they set up unwavering rules that each member must abide by. For example, no one with known psychic abilities would be ever permitted to enter the room. No self-proclaimed mediums, no clairvoyants, no one who might taint the purity of the experiment with unmeasurable influence. This was to be an even playing field for everyone involved. Not one soul would be capable of holding more sway over any of the outcomes than the person sitting next to them. And perhaps most importantly, Philip was to be the only presence they sought. No other spirits, no lost souls, no longing whispers from the dead. Out of respect for the dearly departed and their families, they would summon only him. He was a unique case in this sense. Dr. George Owen, holding true to his quest, deeply desired to explore the boundaries of the human mind and to see if it was capable of conjuring something that simply shouldn't ever exist. And it's here where lies the true twist to his famous experiment. The man they wished to beckon for, Philip Aylesford, had never actually existed. He was a ghost without a past. He had never drawn breath nor wandered the halls of any grand estate. He never felt the pull of love or the immense despair of loss. A specter born not from tragedy, but solely by the inspired minds of the 8 devoted participants. This is not to say Philip's meticulously crafted backstory would not harbor such themes, only that they had never actually happened. In truth, the memory of his false life was rich in detail and layered in sorrow. The lengths the group would go in order to fully flesh out his forged history, well, some might have called it excessive. They imagined him as a 17th century English aristocrat, a man whose considerable reputation demanded both respect and admiration. As a devout Catholic and unwavering loyalist during the English Civil War, he played his silent role in history with as much dignity as one could hope for themselves. But despite all this, fate would ensure he lived a burdensome life. He had found himself bound to a cold, loveless marriage with Dorothea, a woman born of high society and low warmth. Her beauty was as sharp as the words she wielded against him. For years, he endured the life that was given to him, until one fateful ride through the countryside changed everything. Along the hedgerows neighboring the golden wheat fields was a gorgeous woman, nearly indescribable, sauntering along without a care in the world. Her raven black hair danced in the breeze, her piercing eyes peered deep through his, and a welcoming smile beckoned him to dismount his horse. Philip Aylesford was smitten by this rare gem at first sight. Her name was Margot, and the burning passion she held for life had lured Philip to sharing a similar zest for something more out of his. For a time, the two would meet in secrecy, their hidden rendezvous developing into a full affair under the blanket of stars. However, secrets to this degree often have a way of unraveling, and Dorothea would soon discover the truth. Enraged by the adultery, she accused Margot of witchcraft, exclaiming the woman had ensnared her husband's soul with dark magic. Philip, paralyzed by fear, remained silent in response to the accusations and slander, unwilling to risk his reputation further for the woman he adored. And so he watched in torment as Margot was dragged before the courts, branded as a sorceress, and condemned to the stake. She died, burning amongst the flames. Heartbroken and stricken with guilt, Philip's entire life unraveled as the days passed him by. The weight of his cowardice was too great to bear, so in 1654, he would end his own life. This was the tale the group poured their hearts into, each detail sculpted and refined, each moment given life through their will alone. Philip's past was fiction, but they believed in it. It was paramount they fully commit themselves to his history, focusing their thoughts, their emotions, and their entire energy into it. They hoped their belief would be powerful enough to make him seem real. Although mere thoughts alone, they believed, were not enough to accomplish their goal. They would need to see the world he might have lived in to truly appreciate his life. So, devoted to their task, some of the members even crossed the ocean, journeying from Canada to England, seeking out the places he could have lived, walking the paths he never truly walked, and standing in the ruins of a history that had never been. Eventually, the group mutually agreed upon every aspect of Philip's life. Everything needed to align perfectly, his story woven so seamlessly that no crack could form in the illusion. The excursion team captured various photographs and had written diligent notes as they fully immersed themselves in the time that should have been his. They documented the grand estates, the rolling countryside, and the candlelit chambers where he might have once pondered his dreary fate. Next, the group convened on the features that would befit their imaginary subject. Did his eyes have a certain shade of particular color? Did his immense sorrow weigh heavily in his gaze? They discussed his habits, from the admirable to the deplorable. Was he known as a kind man, or did he exhibit a volatile temper? How did he behave towards those around him? Each question they asked sharpened their vision, until at last, Andy would put pencil to paper, and they would finally have their man. All that was left to do was to summon him. As it was to be expected, progress was agonizingly slow at first. The 8 participants, along with the 2 observers, had struck an agreement to meet every week for the following year. Their creation demanded patience, thus they would oblige it. Each session began in a similar ritualistic fashion. They would sit in a circle around an old table, their gazes affixed upon the lone image of Philip placed in its center. The room itself was never shrouded in total darkness. Instead, the dim flickering of candlelight projected restless shadows against the wall and permitted the observers with enough glow to see the words they would put to paper. Recused to a single corner, both Dr. Owen and Dr. Whitten sat in silence as they watched the group commence their rituals, their presence itself a specter in the background. Following any brief pleasantries shared amongst the group, they began their evenings deep in meditation, their entire mental facilities focused solely on Philip. After a while, their hushed, fervent voices would erupt into a crescendo as they broke the stillness of the room to exchange their impressions and sensations felt during those delicate moments. Had they felt anything different? A shift in the air, a feeling in their chest that something had changed. As the long months pressed on and their bewitching habits began to grow in duration, something strange began to happen. The more they immersed themselves in his story, the more time spent discussing him, the more real he became. The boundaries between their imagination and memory began to slowly blur. They no longer merely recited his history, they remembered it by heart. It was as if Philip had truly lived, a man of flesh and bone whose fate had long ago since passed, but was nonetheless real to them now. And yet, he would not show himself to them. After a full year had passed, there was little to show for their efforts aside from puddles of melted wax and settled dust. The room was heavy with unanswered questions. Despite their unwavering dedication, their constant whispered enticements, Philip remained silent. Was he simply beyond their reach? Had the experiment failed? Iris Owen, dedicated to their success, found herself haunted by a single question. What was it that they were missing? To the fullest extent, Philip existed in their minds, and yet he remained elusive, just out of reach. Passionate in their pursuit, Iris immersed herself in the writings of past psychical researchers, combing through the accounts of various 19th century seances, rigorously searching for their missing key. There was one element that stood out to her: energy. It was not enough to simply call to the dead. The living had to feel them. Emotion was the bridge they would have to cross. In the past, joy, sorrow, anger, longing, whatever essence the spirit carried in life must be reflected in those who sought them. Accordingly, the group shifted their approach in light of this revelation. Now infused with emotion, their gatherings became more lively. They called for their subject not with sterile repetition and silent thoughts, but now with enthusiasm. In the eyes of Dr. Owen, this change in their methodology proved to be quite entrancing, though he remained steadfast that certain rules remained immutable. For instance, the room would never be plunged into complete darkness, and there would continue to be no singular leader or medium to guide the sessions. No voice was permitted to be more powerful than the others. Beyond that, they were free to experiment as they saw fit. And so, they continued their midnight meetings, week after week, pouring their beliefs, energy, and lives into their seemingly impossible goal. For some time after, nothing of substance would be noted. No responses by an ethereal entity, no flicker of acknowledgement to their efforts, only silence. Until, in the dead hour of a quiet evening, something would heed their call. Something had finally answered them. It was nearly unnoticeable at first. After having conducted several sessions in this manner, it wasn't until the third or fourth did the table beneath their fingertips begin to shudder so very faintly they might have imagined it. Almost imperceptible vibrations coursed through the wooden top and down its legs. They began to exchange wary glances, each silently wondering if they had been the cause, if a misplaced hand or shifting in weight had somehow unsettled it. Yet, as the sessions continued in length, so too did the spectral happenings grow more frequent. The table no longer simply trembled ever so slightly. It began to move all on its own without a single hand resting upon it. Objects resting on its surface began to stir and spin on their own accord. One such instance was when the group experimented with a small piece of candy, placing the sweet at its center. The table itself would then tilt onto two legs, leaning at a 45-degree angle, while the wrapped candy remained unmoved, as if held by an invisible hand. In an attempt to recreate this scene, the 8 participants were never successful. Then came the sounds. Soft in the beginning, an occasional creak or whisper of movement in the still air, but soon they steadily grew unmistakable. The wallpaper seemed to rustle with phantom touches. The window panes quivered in response to faint tappings, rhythms far too purposeful to be dismissed as only the wind. Each time, the group sat in a frozen disbelief. When at last, Dorothy gave words to the thoughts that had been drifting in everyone's minds like a heavy fog. I wonder if Philip is doing this. In that precise moment, as if waiting for the cue, a single sharp knock echoed out from the center of the table. Philip had answered at last. From that night going forward, Philip was always there. Though, while his voice remained silent, he communicated in his own special way, through quick and deliberate knocks, answering their ceaseless questions, 1 rap for yes and 2 for no. Once this line of communication was established, the group had coaxed him into confirming his story, carefully going over each piece together with the echo of their creation. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, Philip's answer aligned almost perfectly with the history they had woven for him, as if his spirit had stepped in and fulfilled the life they had created. Such formal inquiries were all well and fine, but the group found, after having spent well over a year willing him into existence, that he became a welcomed presence. They treated him as a friend, They would greet him warmly at the start of each session, and in turn, Philip would wrap his greeting back to them, tapping beneath each participant's palms as if offering them a spectral handshake. Then came the singing. On many evenings, the 8 would break out into song, their lively melodies filling the room, and Philip, their Philip, would join them, tapping in rhythm upon the table, his invisible hand keeping in time with their voices. His influence did not stop there. As the weeks progressed, so too did his apparent strength. What had begun as subtle vibrations beneath their fingertips soon became undeniable movements. At first, the table merely trembled, then tilted onto 2 legs at their request, and then it lifted, all on its own. No longer bound to the floor, whatever table they had brought into the room, Philip was seemingly able to lift the entirety of the furniture completely off the ground, suspended in the air by an unseen force. Almost as if it were a game, the table would then move around the room, gliding effortlessly towards particular members, chasing them as they laughed in carefree glee. With no one within its immediate vicinity that could possibly cause such activity, it left the entire group baffled as to how it was even possible. Mind you, despite the wonders unfolding before them, the group never lost sight of the truth. Philip was theirs, a being born strictly from their own thoughts and their collective will. And because of that, his knowledge and capabilities were limited. When less than half the room was filled with the original members, any influence Philip might have had on the space appeared to weaken. When asked about historical events outside his fabricated life, he often faltered, offering incorrect answers that, under scrutiny, reflected the gaps in the group's own knowledge rather than by his deception. He only knew as much as they knew. Philip was no ancient spirit nor centuries-old lingering soul. But then if he wasn't those, what was he? In the late summer of 1974, the group had made the decision to step away from the dimly lit room and take a brief recess from their gatherings, if only for a short while. Their experiment had yielded remarkable results thus far, and Doctors Owen and Witten felt compelled to confer on both their progress and conclusions. By all measures, the Philip experiment had been an undeniable success. The consistent wrappings and movement of objects had overwhelmingly convinced those involved that without psychokinetic talents, certain paranormal phenomena could eventually be produced, and while in full light. But of course, for such studies to be considered reliable, science demands repetition. While the original group temporarily disbanded, Dr. Owen wasted no time in assembling a new set of participants, complete strangers to the first experiment and with no prior connection to Philip. If what they had witnessed was truly a product of human consciousness alone, it should be replicable with an entirely new cast and creation. Thus was born the character of Lilith, a French-Canadian young woman born from a wartime tragedy. She was a member of the French resistance in the harrowing years of World War II and had been subsequently captured and executed by Nazi soldiers. Within a mere 5 weeks from their first session, their table started to stir beneath their hands. In the coming days, the air became thick with an unseen change, and then the raps began. They were familiar, sharp, and deliberate, dutifully answering every query presented. Philip had not been an anomaly. As a result of this second experiment, Owen asserts that any group of people, if sufficiently committed, were capable of acquiring the ability to generate such phenomena. But this revelation brought forth another question. Who was it, really, that was truly answering? Were such spectacles produced solely by the living participants themselves, Or could disembodied spirits truly share a minor role? Neither group ever went as far as to claim that all apparitions were mere figments of the mind, phantoms born from the subconscious with no independent existence. Instead, they framed their experiences within the context of psychokinetic and poltergeist phenomena. There was an undeniable pattern that arose. When members of the group were absent or unwell, Philip's presence was severely weakened, his responses dulled from their full potential. During their break, some members even reported experiencing very minor activities happening around their homes when their minds drifted to Philip, but the activity paled in comparison when the 8 were fully together. Owen theorized that the energy fueling the manifestations had to have been directly feeding from the group members' collective focus on one singular purpose, drawing Philip out and having him interact with the world around him. Dr. Witten, peering into the experiment through a psychological lens, turned to Jungian theory for possible answers. In the book Conjuring Up Philip by Iris Owen, Witten had outlined his belief that the group's very approach, a mixture of playfulness and ritual, had caused a regression of sorts. By adopting a childlike state of mind, they had shed the rigid boundaries of reality, of which lacked knowledge of the laws of physics, and unwittingly embraced a world where the impossible could happen simply because they wished it to. But beneath the surface, Witten suspected something deeper was at work. He proposed that the group was unknowingly acting out subconscious conflicts, their emotions feeding the phenomena like dry tinder to a flame. Witten then also suggests that Dr. Owen himself may have become somewhat of a symbolic father figure, one of whom the children, or participants of the experiment, desperately sought to impress. They passionately believed in the mantra, "If I want it to happen, then it will." There is certainly something to be said about the psychological and emotional impact the experiment had held over the 8 members of the group. They wished to believe in Philip to such a great extent that the lines between their creative narrative and their sessions began to blur. While the sessions had been carefully documented right from the beginning through meticulous notes penned by the 2 doctors, and the occasional recordings that helped preserve their work, there remained a deeper need for further analysis and documentation. The phenomena defied conventional understandings of the human mind relating to the paranormal, and those who observed it could not dismiss its implications so easily. It was then that Alan Gould, a British psychologist of repute, turned his attention towards the case. He was a scholar of biological psychology and neuropsychology at the University of Nottingham, and was no stranger to the world of the uncanny. His work in the PSI research community had made him a respected figure for his investigations and commentary, notably in the areas of poltergeists, mediumship, and the early history of psychical research. As a past president of the Society for Psychical Research and a seasoned author on supernatural phenomena, his expertise carried a bit of weight. Compelled by the mysteries surrounding the Philip experiment upon first catching wind of it, Gould sought out answers to a few of the questions surrounding it. He personally recorded the spectral rappings, those eerie, unexplained knocks said to emanate from the disembodied hands of Philip. He translated the faint tappings into intricate sound charts, and what he uncovered was quite astonishing. The acoustic qualities of these raps were unlike any naturally occurring sound that could have been produced by a living person. Later, the group themselves would be summoned to Cleveland, Ohio, where an audience of scholars, physicists, and psychologists eagerly awaited a live demonstration of the experiment. Of course, every member involved had been given an invitation, Philip included. Under the piercing scrutiny of the skeptical community, the auditorium brimmed with anticipation at the prospect of witnessing such a bizarre case. The ensuing table movements and consistent rappings left many bewildered, but there was, however, no lack of skepticism amongst the gathered crowd. Several experts proposed a rational explanation for the mysterious happenings as being caused by a subtle psychological phenomenon known as the ideomotor effect. This well-documented psychological mechanism explains how individuals may sometimes cause the motion subconsciously, especially when they expect or believe in a certain outcome. The ideomotor effect has also been noted to play a significant role in Ouija board sessions, when the participants' own hands subtly shift without them realizing, spelling out certain words or patterns they're subconsciously expecting. Under the power of suggestion, these manifesting involuntary actions are often misinterpreted as a spirit who had influenced the board's planchette. Moreover, the role of suggestibility and the power of group dynamics could also not be understated, as it is often noted, in a highly charged environment where the participants are deeply focused on a narrative, they are more prone to interpret ambiguous stimuli as significant or paranormal. The experiment was then challenged by one particularly skeptical physicist who suggested he sit on top of the table and have the participants move away to see if Philip was still able to wobble or tilt it under his weight. The room held its breath as he took his seat, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the table bucked violently beneath him, as if struck by an unseen force, and the prideful man violently tumbled to the ground, his panicked face pale with shock. The nature behind that sudden force that day would never be determined. While the sessions had been meticulously documented through audio recordings, strictly for the aid of Doctors Owen and Witten to reflect with, the Philip experiment had remained largely confined in terms of who observed its results. Only those who sought permission to witness the strange occurrences firsthand had been privy to the ethereal happenings. But by this point in time, Philip's enigmatic reputation had grown so large that it had begun to seep beyond the walls of those controlled sessions, drawing in the interests of journalists, television personalities, and the general media. What had once been an obscure experiment was now a constant whisper on the lips of those fascinated by the unknown. Word had begun to spread, and soon the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation sought to capture the mystery for their viewers. The result was a 1-hour documentary titled Philip, the Imaginary Ghost. Within its distorted frames and crackling audio, the 8 participants recount their one-of-a-kind experiences with Philip and produced a demonstration of his power on stage. They begin, as they always did, with gentle greetings that eventually evolved into joyous songs and laughter, a stark contrast to the eerie raps and uncanny table movements that follow in response. To those watching from the comfort of their homes, it was unlike anything they had ever seen, comparable to only Hollywood silver screens. This wasn't a fictional movie or dramatized program. It was real people in real time summoning something from the void. Unsurprisingly, the broadcasting ignited an uncontrollable inferno of public fascination, of which effortlessly tapped into the timeless human hunger to understand the unknown. The Philip experiment is more than a common ghost story. It's a challenge, urging us to balance our skepticism with curiosity and to embrace both the rigor of hard science and the boundless potential of the unexplained. True discovery does not lie in blind belief nor outright dismissal, but in the willingness to question, to explore, and to entertain the idea that reality may be far stranger than we ever could imagine. It's a haunting testament to humanity's relentless pursuit of meaning, traversing the possibilities that blur the line between reality and imagination. It's a reminder that in our search for understanding, we are often drawn to the very edges of what we believe to be possible, peering into the unknown with both a deep fascination and hesitant trepidation. In the end, the experiment was not just about Philip. It's about us. It forces us to ask, how powerful is the human mind? What are its true capabilities? Will we ever understand its unique complexity? The experiment remains as an enigma to this day, a case study that lingers at the crossroads of science and the supernatural. Its influence on the field of parapsychology is undeniable, offering not only a unique methodology for probing the mysteries of the human mind, but also offers potential that beckons further inquiry. It bravely dares other researchers to peer beyond the veil of conventional science, to push against the boundaries of what is known and what is merely assumed. Its legacy, however, is steeped in controversy. There are many mixed reactions, from intrigue to acceptance and skepticism to dismissal. This undeniable tension serves as a reminder that true discovery relies heavily on science that is both rigorous and adaptive, where in the event certainty may falter, possibility has the opportunity to rise. I would be remiss not to mention a particularly intriguing aspect of the experiment, when during one session, Sydney, half-jokingly, warned Philip that if he failed to answer them, the group might send him away forever. Almost immediately, the phenomena fell silent, and the group found themselves frantically striving to coax their elusive creation back in their next session. With sighs of relief, they succeeded in bringing Philip back, but it was this fragile episode that had confirmed their suspicions, that an entity born of collective thought could be unmade just as easily. It offered a strange comfort that if Philip had ever become belligerent or even dangerous, he could be banished by their own will. Amidst the theatrics of it all, a deeper transformation had seemed to have taken hold on the group themselves, as noted by Dr. Owen. According to him, the experiment had an unexpected, almost therapeutic effect on its participants. The group had obviously grown quite close to one another, eventually evolving into a found family that was bound together by a shared wonder. Al observed that they had become very close-knit and happier when they were together, while Andy noted a newfound surge in her social confidence, a complete disappearance of her shyness. It was as if they had become more attuned to one another and the world around them. At its heart, the Philip experiment offers the astonishing suggestion that the human mind, one unified in belief and purpose, can wield the power to shape not only individual lives, but also the physical world around us. Thank you everyone for listening to this very perplexing episode here on the Moonlight Lore podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. This has been a case that I've wanted to cover for quite some time now, and I'm certainly glad I did because I find the whole premise behind the experiment to be incredibly fascinating. I watched the short documentary showcasing the group's ability to draw Philip out and have him interact with the table they're demonstrating with, and I have to say it's certainly an interesting watch. I'm going to try and upload it to the YouTube page as well, so if anyone is also interested in viewing it, they can probably find it there if I'm able to do that. Mind you, the quality is from the 70s, so both the audio and video are not the greatest quality, but you can certainly watch and understand everything that's happening no problem. One thing I would like to comment about is the table movements done by the group. It's very difficult to see the entirety of the metal table they use, not due necessarily to poor video quality, but rather because it's a small table and there are 8 participants crowding it. The wrapping that I could barely make out was picked up over the microphone as well, since the studio had placed one under the table to try and catch any sounds, but they are quite faint and constantly contend with the loud voices of the host and the participants. But of course, if anyone is interested in watching the video, I think it's about 40 minutes long, and I'll upload it to the YouTube page sometime after the release of this episode. I'll probably also take some clippings of it and maybe put those on the Instagram as well, just in case there are those of you who don't necessarily want to watch a 40-minute documentary about it. I would be interested to know what others might feel about this particular case. I know people who believe in the paranormal are quite passionate about it, so I want to emphasize that the group never went as far as to claim that all paranormal encounters could be derived from the human mind alone. They were quite adamant about that. But the fact that they were able to conjure something that never existed before their sessions, then have it behaving like a poltergeist, is certainly a really interesting subject for conversation. Granted, I am by no means any expert in psychokinetic phenomena, parapsychology, or paranormal studies for that matter, so my knowledge in those fields are certainly limited to a very basic understanding. But as many might know who have found their interest to delve into the world of poltergeist activity, might what happens in those cases have some remnants of relatability to the Philip experiment? The Enfield poltergeist story is one that had immediately come to mind when I was thinking about this. This was a 1977 haunting that occurred in London, I believe, in the United Kingdom. It involved a family witnessing furniture move on its own and knocking throughout their home. If my memory is correct, and it might be wrong, I thought quite a few other people had investigated the case and were also eyewitness to the paranormal happenings in the house, but it was later deemed as a hoax perpetrated by the two young girls who lived in that home. Now, I honestly can't really remember if there were still doubts or not on how the girls managed to move the furniture, but if so, perhaps there may be a link from cases like the Enfield haunting to the Philip experiment, in that simply by expecting or wanting something to happen, the manifested energy then allows for those seemingly impossible occurrences to unfold. That might be something we explore in the future, but for now, my throat is telling me that I've talked enough, so I will get to all the promotion stuff here and let you all go. If you enjoyed hearing this episode, or any of the others I've written and produced on here, or are hoping to hear more in the future, please consider supporting the podcast. There are a few ways one could go about doing this. Both Spotify and iTunes have rating systems, so if you are listening on one of those or another app that offers it, please give the show a 5-star review. Alternatively, you can also post the show to your social media and tell your friends and family that, hey, this is a pretty interesting episode or show, try checking it out. Both of those go a very long way in helping any podcast grow and become more noticeable on the podcast charts. And also, if you're able, you can donate to the show's Patreon by following the link in the description of this episode. For the price of a cup of coffee a month, well, I actually don't drink coffee, so I don't really know what the price of a cup of coffee would be. But maybe around a cup of coffee per month. I think it's $5. You can help me manage the costs of running the show. Editing, subscriptions, hosting fees, and all that fun stuff that comes with making a podcast does add up, so any help is appreciated. There's also a list of exclusive episodes over there that aren't available on the main feed here, as a sort of thanks to those who donate. Finally, I believe that's all I need to say here, I think. So again, I hope you all enjoyed this episode and are looking forward to more. Oh, I did have a couple people ask about the scheduling of the show, and I'm going to start to continue with the bi-weekly episodes, but every third episode will be for the Patreon. So basically, there will be a short break on the main feed every now and then, but that's mainly just to help me with the scheduling. It takes some time to do all of this, all the writing and research and recording and editing and producing all on my own, so it's mainly just to help me. With that said, though, thank you all for listening. I do appreciate it. And I hope to see you all here again on the next episode.
at the moment, while I'm recording this, I don't know what the topic will be for the next one, so stay tuned for that. Anyways, you all take care. Have a good one, and I'll see you later.